Hey everybody, so a couple days ago I put up a video and I focused on the topic Charlie Kirk can be two things at the same time. Actually, a person or a group of people can be more than two things at the same time. And even when those things seem to be somewhat contradictory to each other, both or all can be true. So I got a lot of traction on that video so far, at least relative to other videos on my channel. And I was a little bit surprised because even though I knew that, any discussion topic around Charlie Kirk is going to be a very hot topic right now for obvious and very unfortunate reasons, um, I also recognize that there's a lot of content being put out that references Charlie Kirk right now. So, my little tiny YouTube channel, I didn't really expect to get more than a few views on it. And it's in the hundreds and climbing. So I want to go into a little bit further detail on a couple of things that I said because I think it's fair to do that at this point. I spent 90 to 95%, I would say, of that discussion talking about the personal integrity that I think Charlie Kirk had. And I haven't watched a whole lot of his content, and most of it that I have watched has been in the days and over a week now following his death. So I am watching it with a pretty generous mindset, I think, because honestly, any kind, reasonable, considerate person does look at a person with a little bit more generosity, at least after they've not only died, but been killed or assassinated. Um, and obviously, no viewpoint that he held in his life justifies that, and nothing justifies celebrating it. I want to make that super clear off the bat that although I have a more complex and more nuanced view of Charlie and of what he said, I don't think anything close to that anything he said justified his murder. And I certainly don't think that it should be celebrated. Um, I actually find it completely saddening and sickening at the same time to see anybody celebrating his murder. I also find it, and this is probably worth saying right now, I also find it saddening and sickening that anybody would mock Joe Biden for having a cancer diagnosis. I find it saddening and sickening that anybody would have that instant, um, deep vitriol and anger towards a person when a tragedy has occurred or is occurring to that person. I want to say that up front because I don't want to make any bones about it, and I actually think that having watched Charlie Kirk's content, that he didn't make bones about where he stood on things. He was pretty clear. He was pretty direct. He wasn't afraid to use insensitive language. And I don't think we necessarily should always be afraid to use insensitive language, especially if it is necessary to convey a point. Although when it's used unnecessarily, it is a little bit concerning, and I'll go into a little more detail on that in this video. But I want to make my position very clear and not leave room for confusion. I believe that all forms of mocking a human being when they are faced with tragedy is vile and is extreme. So in the 5 to 10% of the video when I wasn't making the case that I think Charlie Kirk was a very principled and was a very principled person who had a lot of personal integrity, I did say that I think he was a prejudiced person. And I didn't really support that because I didn't want to spend a lot of time trying to tear apart Charlie Kirk's arguments or things that he said, which I will keep in context because I think it is important. I think that if you have a good argument, you should be able to acknowledge what the other person said in full context without trying to twist their intent or anything else, and you should be able to still make your good argument against it. or your good argument for a different point or a different perspective. I have seen a lot of the taking out of context stuff, and I don't appreciate it. I don't buy it. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's hurtful, and it's divisive, and it's frustrating, not only to people on the opposite side who disagree with it, but it's frustrating to me, even if I agree with the point that someone's making. If they make their point by taking someone else's words out of context or misrepresenting them or twisting them, then that invalidates the point, and it smells bad, and I don't like it. So, all right, let's talk about this. Charlie Kirk, was he prejudiced? Why would I even say that? I had a few people respond on that other video and say, look, I've looked through thousands of hours of him speaking. I didn't see a single thing he said that could even be interpreted as being prejudiced. And I don't know what you're looking at. But let me be specific. Here's an example. And again, this is in no way like taking an opportunity that, you know, he can't defend his stance anymore. I genuinely believe that Charlie believed in debate. He believed in freedom of speech. He believed in bringing logic. I don't always agree with his logic, but I think he really did believe in bringing logic to the debate, and also being willing to make statements of logic, even if it appears insensitive. I know it might appear insensitive this soon after someone's death to debate something that they said, but I really do not think, as I said in the last video, that Charlie would want his death to be a get out of a conversation free card. I don't take him as that type of person. I think that he had a lot more substance as a human being than to think that. And I think Charlie probably would have not necessarily changed anything about the way that he debated and the way that he lived his life, even if he knew that this was how it was going to end. I think the only way he'd change something is if he really believed that that this changed the argument that he had to make, that, you know, it actually convinced him to believe something other than what he actually believed. I think that was kind of the only situation in which he would change his opinion. So I am going to lay it right out there. I'm going to say what I think was prejudiced, and I'm going to make my case, knowing that you have every right to, you know, post a comment, make a statement, disagree, argue, debate, whatever. That's very much in the spirit of what this person believed in. So there's a few different, and this came up, this must have been a fairly frequent topic for him, because in the relatively small amount of things that I have watched, pretty much at random, of him speaking, I've heard multiple statements about it. The one that I will reference here is he's speaking on a podcast. He's speaking to people he basically agrees with. I believe there's 4 total people speaking, and they're saying how they do not want people who have gotten into the pilot seat of an airplane to be anything other than, I wish I could say that they were really saying they don't want someone who is the product of affirmative action to be in the pilot seat. But I watched a pretty good exchange, multiple people speaking, everybody nodding, and what they were actually saying was, and I'll try to look this video up and link it here so you can see it for yourself, but what they're really saying was, I want my pilot to have a little bit of a southern drawl, and I want them to talk about the 30,000 flight hours they've logged, and I want them to say they're kind of bored with this, to be honest with you. They've done it for a really long time. They could do it in their sleep. And then Charlie Kirk chimes in, and he says, and he's been nodding this whole time, like he's been contributing this whole time. Then he says, yeah, I really don't want my pilot to be named LaQuisha James. This is relevant because what I wish he had said, like what I would be very able to defend him saying, is I do not want my pilot to be the product of affirmative action. And then we can have a debate on affirmative action and how, to what extent it really elevates, unqualified people, because that is the argument against it. There's two arguments against it, really. One is that it elevates unqualified people, and we don't want that, period. And then the other argument is that in that process, those unqualified people take the place of qualified people who should have gotten into this program or this university or this job, and we don't want that. So we don't want people who aren't as qualified to get in, and we don't want people who are more qualified to be pushed out. That's kind of the twofold argument against affirmative action. And I think it does justify having a real more in-depth concept or conversation about how affirmative action actually plays out, and whether or not it does effectively do those things. And I think that does warrant a relatively in-depth conversation. What are the principles behind it? How does it actually play out? What are the actual results? Are we, in fact, elevating less qualified people into positions above more qualified people? How can, what are alternatives? That's a conversation we should have as part of this larger conversation. But back to this point, I wish that Charlie Kirk had said, because I really, really want to see him as a not prejudiced person. But so what I wish he had said was, I do not want a less qualified person to be flying my airplane as a result of affirmative action. But what he did say, and we have to hear what he did say, not what you want to reinterpret it as. He did say, I don't want my pilot to be named LaQuisha James. And you could say that's a very small statement. It's just a very brief statement. But out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? It is relevant. It's not like it came out of nowhere. It's not like it's completely unrelated or disconnected to other things that he thinks or feels or believes. And it's concerning that he put it that way, right? Because somebody named LaQuisha James, which kind of sounds like a white person making up what they think a black person's name would be. And I could look it up here and see if there's anyone actually named LaQuisha, and maybe there is. But regardless, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say this is a legitimate, realistic black name. Why don't you want LaQuisha James? There's nothing inherently unqualified about somebody because they're named LaQuisha James, unless you want to make the case that somebody having a more traditional, if this even is a traditional African name, but we get your intent was to state it as a traditional African name. Having that type of name does not mean, that somebody is unqualified. It does not mean that they were the beneficiary of affirmative action at all. And so that's where this stepped across the line from just being somebody who was really willing to put it out there. And right afterwards, by the way, he kind of says and I'm not allowed to say that, because it's racist. And we should be allowed to say that. You're allowed to say that. First of all, let's be clear on that. You're allowed to say that you have freedom of speech in the United States of America, or at least you should. So you are allowed to say that. What you really mean is that people are going to respond to you with negativity for saying it because they perceive that as a racist statement. And by the way, common catchphrase recently, freedom of speech, not freedom of consequences. You say something like that, and the consequence might be that people think you're racist or you are prejudiced. Let's explore. Is it true? Or are you just making a bold statement without concerning yourself? Which he did concern himself. That's why he brought it up right away. But are you just making a bold statement and being willing to make that statement even though it might make people think you're racist? Well, the non-racist version of the statement, the non-prejudiced version of the statement, like I said, would have been, I don't want someone who is the product of affirmative action to be flying my plane. I won't feel as comfortable with that person. And you can say, yeah, you can say that affirmative action was and is designed to elevate Black people into those types of positions. My understanding of affirmative action is that's a little bit more nuanced than that, and that it considers a person's, it considers where they grew up more than it actually considers skin color. But when we're talking about rough places to grow up, disproportionately, Black people grow up in those places, and that goes back to a lot of historical context within the United States as to why that's the case. So it does effectively apply more often to Black people than white people, or I should say people of color than white people, but it is not designed specifically to get Black people into specific positions, right? That's my understanding of it, and again, it warrants a pretty in-depth discussion that I'm not really that prepared to have about the actual mechanics of affirmative action and how it works on a practical level. But you can make a legitimate statement. Affirmative action more often is applied to Black people than white people, and I do not want somebody who was the product of affirmative action flying my plane. Those would be perfectly okay, non-prejudiced statements to make, because you're just stating the first one's a fact. The second one is a reasonable, justifiable opinion on who you want flying your plane. Of course, you want the more qualified person flying your plane. Now, when you brought LaQuisha James into it, instead of just saying, just putting it on the line like it is, that's what made it sound prejudiced. And that's what makes me think it actually came from a place of prejudice, not an intentional one, not a malicious one, but still a place of actual prejudice. Because we are equating, he was equating LaQuisha James to being a Black person who was the product of affirmative action. There's no equation there. There's a possibility. He, you can, but why even use this fictional name to communicate the possibility when all it is a possibility? And when you use an invented Black traditional African Black name as a stand-in for this type of person, this category of person that you're trying to describe and make what might be a legitimate point about, that's, in my opinion, that's coming from most likely a place of prejudice. Because you're starting to replace a legitimate concept with your personal white guy fantasy of what this person looks like and what their name is and what the image that kind of conjures in your mind, in his mind, in his audience's mind when he uses that name. And again, it's a little bit about assumption too, right? Like, I'm going to assume that anyone named LaQuisha James definitely is the product of affirmative action and therefore can be used to represent this person that I'm trying to make a point about. And when something that's just a possibility becomes a direct equation in your mind and in your audience's mind and in the way you communicate about it, instead of just like, or even becomes something we need to look into in the first place. Like, if my pilot's name is, insert typical white name here, do I immediately feel the need to look into all the possible ways that a white person might have climbed the ladder into this position besides being the most intelligent, capable, competent person in the room? Right? And that's also where this potential likelihood of prejudice comes in, because we all know, and we all should know, that while it may be possible for a black person to get into a position that they are not the most possible, most highly qualified person possible, it's also possible that any white person could get into a position for which they are not the most highly qualified person possible. And those mechanisms within our society might look different for those two people, but there is a legitimate possibility of anybody of any color working their way into a position that they are not the most highly qualified person to be in. And to express that concern over and over towards black people specifically, but not express an equivalent concern, might have something to do with prejudice. And besides that, if my airline tells me that this is my pilot, yeah, I could start questioning them on any grounds, no matter what their name is. And I could say, like, are you sure this person's qualified? Well, guess what? Every pilot who's ever flown at some point didn't have 30,000 hours under their belt. So while I might feel most comfortable with a pilot who does, that's not necessarily who I'm going to get. And I need to trust the airline that affirmative action or no affirmative action, or whatever other factor might have brought somebody up into that position, that airline has a minimum standard, and it is an appropriate minimum standard, and the person who they have trusted in that position exceeds it. And we don't really have any factual evidence to believe that that isn't the case with airlines. So it's also kind of like this false flag, and it's a little bit uncomfortable that that false flag happens to be a black woman named LaQuisha James, or any number of other examples in which Charlie Kirk referenced a black person flying an airplane as a point of major concern of his, supposedly due to affirmative action. But that shows a mistrust in every level of oversight at that airline, right? So it doesn't make sense to place the emphasis on the black person, to me. And like I said, I don't think that Charlie Kirk set out to be prejudiced. I don't think that he intended to operate from a place of prejudice on any topic. I think you genuinely, sincerely intended to bring logical arguments and to abide by the logical arguments, even when they came from another person. They forced him to reconsider his position. And I have seen video of him. He is not a person who's incapable of apologizing. I've seen him apologizing. Specifically, there was a video where and it was a really touching video. And it really painted Charlie in a good light, because he took the time to listen to somebody who had been pretty deeply offended by him saying, why do we need these sign language interpreters on things like natural disaster announcements? It's distracting. And I'm sure in the context he said, like, what's up with all this DEI bullcrap? And somebody who was actually deaf spoke to him through an interpreter, and he was using sign language to speak, and the interpreter was interpreting it in real time, and effectively said, look, that's super important. That's our lifeline. we need that. Those of us in our community need that to have this important life-saving information, and you're just worried about like it being distracting. And and I don't really know the terminology, but this type of sign language does not equate to this. It doesn't equate, I guess, to just having subtitles on the screen. Not all of us can read those subtitles, but we can understand the sign language. We really need that. It's not just for show. And Charlie said, I understand. Thank you. I've been corrected on this. I listened. I heard that I was mistaken. I didn't have a full understanding of this topic, and I apologize. I was wrong. It was very sincere. And then the person kind of reiterated a couple times, to the point that even I, who think I'm a patient person, was like, come on, you made your point, like wrap it up. And Charlie continued to just be very humble and say, yeah, I get it. Thank you for being very clear about that. I hear you, and I was wrong. I don't think he's that kind of person who can't admit a mistake and whatever. And I think that if he'd realized he was mistaken about any of these things, he would come out and said it. But I do think that he spoke at times from a position of prejudice. And this was originally going to be a long video detailing kind of the thought process behind affirmative action, as far as I understand it, and trying to give a more thoughtful assessment of whether affirmative action actually results in the unfairness that he kind of felt it does, or and whether it's effective or not, and whatever. But there's a lot I don't really know about the mechanics of it. Like, I understand the concept, and I could give a really good overview of the concept, which I may be able to do super fast here. The concept is that we need to consider a person's aptitude, which is their ability to learn. We need to consider that in some instances more thoroughly than we consider their actual test results and grades, because we understand that people come from significantly different backgrounds. They had significantly different levels of opportunity, and therefore some people are extremely competent, capable, and intelligent, still aren't going to have the same test scores as somebody who is equally capable or even slightly less capable, but had a whole lot of resources in their favor as they grew up to get those good test scores and get good grades. That's a super fast nutshell of what I understand the concept of it to be and the thought process behind it to be. And I don't think it's a perfect system, and I think it's actually a very divisive system that fails to address the root causes of inequality. But having said that, the video is what it is. I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you for watching. I hope that there can be some thoughtful discussion on this, and it probably by no means will be the last video. But thank you for following along as far as you have, and catch you later.